This is a really interesting topic.
Yeah. What do you think, Rex?
I have a lot of questions. First of all, thanks so much for doing this, Sarah.
My pleasure.
And coming on the show.
Thanks for letting me share about this.
How did this study start? Like, what motivated this?
I was doing a postdoc at the National Center for Family and Marriage Research at Bowling Green State University with Wendy Manning. And they said, one of the things we'd like you to do during your postdoc is work with the Toledo Adolescent Relationship Study data. And so I started looking through it, and there was one question on there that was, how many times have you broken up and gotten back together? And I was like, well, that's really interesting because we all know that happens, but we never talk about it in our research.
True.
And so that's what got us started at looking at this, was just to try to understand some basic descriptives of what was happening, and just continued exploring it in that data and other data since.
Are there specific areas that you're looking at to see why what may be causing this trend or behavior amongst people?
So, I think depending on what discipline you're from, you probably look at different factors. So psychologists are most likely to look at individual level factors or couple level factors. So things about people, personality traits or temperaments or mental health challenges or ways of relating to each other that might make more likely these dynamics. As sociologists, we also look at these structural factors. So, if you're dealing with a lot of financial stressors, for example, are you more likely to experience churning because having your relationship under that pressure, does that make it more likely to result in a breakup when you actually really want to be together, but there was just so much pressure at the time that it was hard to navigate your way through. So we want to understand those kind of structural factors because those are often outside of people's control, right? Whether or not you get laid off or something like that is probably outside of your control. And having some understanding of how those big other changes translate into relationship dynamics is something we want to know more about.
Yeah, you mentioned that a lot of it seemed like connecting things to this type of occurrence or dynamic is like one-sided breakups or lingering attachments. Does socioeconomics play into this at all too? Like you're mentioning, if somebody gets laid off or just isn't good with money or something like that.
Yeah, so we see that couples who report higher levels of financial distress are more likely to experience churning. We haven't had the research done to be able to see, do we see more churning among couples when there are layoffs or those kinds of things. So it's just looked at financial distress more generally. But, if I were guessing or hypothesizing, I would guess that those kinds of other forms of financial challenge would also be challenging for relationships as well.
Is there anything that links, like, is there anything common amongst the people who are churning a lot?
Churning is so common, right? It was about half of young adults who had broken up or gotten back together just in their most recent relationship. So that probably means that most people have probably churned at least once in their lives. Right?
So like anybody who eats cheese or something is probably churned at some point.
Right.
I've found the link.
Right. Do you like pizza? You've probably churned. Right.
Yes. Are there any maybe from a heterosexual relationships, is there any particular person who maybe initiates the churning more? Is it more female, more male? Is there any link there?
I don't think we know. I know from research on divorce that women are more likely to initiate divorces than are men. That doesn't mean that they are the cause of the divorce. That means the person who is most likely to begin the paperwork is a woman. I don't know if that similarly applies to the breakup part of a churn, right? Because churning is composed of at least two events, right? The breakup and the reunion. And I have not seen research on who initiates each of those events and whether that's the same every time for couples who have multiple episodes of churning.
That's interesting. I've said this before on the show that I heard this a long time ago and it stuck with me that women will, in a hetero relationship, women will generally grieve before the divorce and the men will grieve after because they didn't. It's just kind of a general thing, but I thought it kind of connected to what you said. You said how far does the study follow these couples or these people that are churning?
So the Toledo adolescent relationship study was focused on younger adults. The other study that I mentioned, the Future of Families and Child Wellbeing, that has actually followed people for so long that the children who were born when the study began are now young adults themselves, and the study is still following them. So that data opens up the possibility for us to see what relationship dynamics will look like among the young adults who experienced parental relationship churning.
That's fascinating. Before I get into that, I want to ask, do these couples ever wind up getting married or committing long term?
Some of these couples are married. And in fact, there is churning among married couples. And one of the things that I was fascinated to see in a study I did with my colleague, Laura Tack, is that sometimes couples disagree about whether or not churning happened. I mean, that's the classic Ross and Rachel, right? Were you on a break or not? And so, these churning dynamics are really complex and not necessarily a point of clarity in couples.
That's interesting. I had another question and it just evaporated. I hate that. This is, okay. So the study followed these people. What is it learning anything with the longer version of this? That's interesting, or?
I mean, eventually, lots of couples break up. And so there's only so long you can follow that relationship. People get in new relationships and then you could attempt to see whether churning occurs in those relationships. But, when I was talking about the need for research and data infrastructure, because a lot of research has not traditionally paid attention to churning, the kind of questions they ask often make it difficult to detect churning in these larger nationally representative studies. And so building that data infrastructure and building it with an awareness of these churning dynamics so that we can follow people over time and learn about on again, off again episodes would really allow us to say more and learn more about these dynamics that are so common over time.
That is fascinating. Like, one of the things I've learned being a producer for this show that has blown me away, and I bring it up often when my wife and I have conflicts, is that more successful relationships generally are high conflict. So that's something fascinating I've learned about this whole relationship dynamic. What is something fascinating that you've learned from this study that has surprised you or just been very interesting?
So I would say in the research that I've seen, high quality relationships are not necessarily high conflict. Conflict comes in a lot of different forms, and what might feel like conflict to some people is another person's minor disagreement. And conflict can be more and less damaging, right? So conflict managed well is probably productive for a relationship, and conflict managed poorly can really undermine a relationship. From this study, I think just understanding that there's probably a lot of dynamics out there between couples that researchers don't attend to. And we should look for clues in pop culture. What are people talking about? What are people paying attention to? Because sometimes we get stuck in asking about the dynamics that are easy, right? It's easy to say, are you together or not? It's much more complex to ask about Are you on again, off again? Are you a little unclear? Is your status undefined? Right? The messiness of relationships sometimes gets erased in research. And I think understanding better how to measure and model the messiness so that research can come closer to answering the questions that people have about their real lives is one of the things this study has brought out for me.
My last question is, during the study, is it ever asked, like, how far back did your parents turn? Did your grandparents turn? Like, is there any like kind of reach back to see how far maybe this goes, or any research that might include that in history?
So in research, we don't usually use the term churning. So, in studies, they'll ask, like, what's the status of your relationship with this person? And you might say, like, we're together, we're separated, it's unclear. And because it's what we call longitudinal, so it asks people the same questions over time. We can also look at, did somebody say in one year that they were together, in the next year that they were broken up, and in the next year that they were together? And so we can gather both those direct measures, somebody saying we're on again, off again, and somebody sort of having reported together, not together, together again, that we can indirectly assess it. So we don't ask about churning necessarily. And I don't know that people would always know that about their own parents, right? If couples disagree with each other about whether they've churned, we could imagine that those dynamics might not be wholly visible to children, especially if it was happening when they were at young ages.
That's true.
I like history a lot. So I always like reading about, different people and different events that happened. And I just wonder if there's any evidence of this too, like in historical record among, I don't know, European kings and lords or whatever. It would be interesting to me to see how far back this goes, and if there's like cultural influences that might be more, what's the word I'm looking, like okay with churning, or if there's other cultures that are like, no, you don't churn at all, break up, that's it, it's over, I'm just curious.
For any historians who are out there, there's your next project.
In my mind, it almost might seem embarrassing a little bit to write about or to share or anything if it's kind of looked at. It's like, oh man, we broke up and got back together. Mm-hmm. But I want to share. I don't want to let anyone else know, type of a thing. I'm just, again, hypothesizing and thinking back of, I don't know how much they would document those types of things.
Romeo and Juliet, that's kind of,
there you go.
There's some churning, I think, going on there.
It could be so inspiring if they did write about it, though, right?
Yeah.
It's inspiring. It is embarrassing, I think, to have that make-up, break-up pattern. And that we just need help sometimes.
I like that. Well, in history, there's usually telltale signs, too, that something happened. Like, hey, this person was here, and then they weren't here, and then they're back again. What are they doing,
Yeah.
But anyways.
Sarah, thank you.
Yes.
That's my mind running around.
Yeah, we love your mind, Rex.
Yeah, that's right.
And we love your research, Sarah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, for making time to come on today. We sure appreciate it.
And the lights never went out.
No, the lights stayed on the whole time.
It was magic. That's great. Thanks for joining us today. Hey, do us a favor and take a second to subscribe to our podcast and the Utah Marriage Commission YouTube channel at Utah Marriage Commission, where you can watch this and every episode of the show. Be sure to smash the like button, leave a comment, and share this episode with a friend. You can also follow and interact with us on Instagram at Stronger Marriage Live and Facebook at Stronger Marriage. So be sure to share with us which topics you loved or which guests we should have on the show next. If you want even more resources to improve your marriage or relationship connection, visit strongermarriage.org, where you'll find free workshops, e-courses, in-depth webinars, relationship surveys, and more. Each episode of Stronger Marriage Connection is hosted and sponsored by the Utah Marriage Commission at Utah State University. And finally, a big thanks to our producer, Rex Polanis, and the team at Utah State University, and you, our audience. You make this show possible. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of the Utah Marriage Commission.